All right, today we're diving into one of the 20th century's most brutal and, honestly, most important conflicts, the Spanish Civil War. This was a war that didn't just tear a country apart. In a lot of ways, it set the stage for something much, much bigger. So, picture this. From 1936 to 1939, Spain is completely consumed by a war that isn't just happening on some distant battlefield. No, it's being fought in the streets, in the villages, and sometimes literally between brothers in the same family. This was a fight for the very soul of the nation. But here's the thing, this wasn't just Spain's problem. The world's great powers were all watching, and they got involved. They saw Spain as a perfect testing ground for new weapons, new military tactics, and for the huge ideological battle between fascism and communism that was brewing. So it really makes you ask, was this just a civil war, or was it the first act, the dress rehearsal, for World War II? To really get why this happened, we've got to rewind a little. We need to look at the deep cracks, the fault lines, that were running through Spanish society long before a single shot was ever fired. You see, Spain was basically split in two. On one side, you had what you might call Old Spain. These were the traditionalists, fiercely loyal to the king and the power of the Catholic Church. But on the other side, you had New Spain, these modernizers who supported the new republic. They wanted a secular country, rights for workers, and land reform. I mean, these weren't just two different opinions. They were two totally different visions for a country that just could not coexist. And trust me, this was not some polite political debate. The 5 years before the war were like a pressure cooker ready to explode. We're talking political assassinations, massive strikes, even a failed military coup way back in '32. Everything was pushing people to the extremes. So when the left-wing coalition, the Popular Front, barely won the election in 1936, a lot of people on the right basically decided that democracy just wasn't working anymore. That feeling just boiled over in the summer of 1936. But the original plan wasn't for a long, bloody war. It was supposed to be a quick, clean military coup to grab power and restore order. This was the spark that lit the fuse. Calvo Sotelo was a huge voice for the conservatives and monarchists, so when he was murdered, and murdered by state police officers no less, it was all the justification the military plotters, guys like General Mola, and of course Francisco Franco, needed to finally make their move. And this right here is the critical moment. The coup kicks off on July 17th. It works in some places, but it fails, and this is key. It fails in the biggest cities like Madrid and Barcelona. Why? Because workers' militias literally took to the streets with guns to defend the republic. And because the coup wasn't a total success, it wasn't a quick victory. Instead, it just shattered the country in two, and the failed coup descended into a horrifying all-out war. Okay, so as the battle lines were drawn across the country, two very broad and really complex groups started to form. On one side, you had the Republicans. They were a real mix of people: socialists, communists, anarchists, even separatists from regions like the Basque Country and Catalonia, all united in defending the elected government. And on the other side, you had the Nationalists. This was a coalition of fascists, monarchists, and religious conservatives, all brought together by their hatred of communism and their goal of creating an authoritarian state, led by General Franco. And almost right away, this Spanish fight became everybody's fight. The big powers around the world looked at Spain and saw a perfect arena, a chessboard, to play out their own agendas. Now, officially, everybody was supposed to stay out of it. There was this big non-intervention agreement signed by 27 countries, including Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. But in reality, it was a complete farce from day one. The most important countries that signed it had absolutely no intention of following the rules. Here's what was really going on. Franco's nationalists were getting massive help from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. I'm talking tens of thousands of Italian soldiers. And Germany's notorious Condor Legion Air Force, who used Spain to practice the blitzkrieg tactics they were about to use on the rest of Europe. The Republic's biggest supporter was the Soviet Union, along with some help from Mexico, and of course, the thousands of foreign volunteers who traveled to Spain to fight fascism in the famous International Brigades. And this really gets at how the rest of the world saw it. Depending on which side you were on, this wasn't just a war in Spain. It was an epic struggle between good and evil. It was tyranny versus freedom, unless, of course, you saw it as a crusade to save Christian civilization from the communist hordes. The stakes felt absolute. So, with the world's most advanced armies testing their new toys and strategies on Spanish soil, how did this all end? And what was the devastating cost? Well, for 3 years, it was a slow, agonizing grind. But the Nationalists were better organized and had way more supplies, thanks to Germany and Italy. They slowly pushed forward, conquering the industrial north in 37, and then they drove all the way to the coast, literally slicing the Republic's territory in half. After Catalonia fell, it was only a matter of time. On April 1, 1939, Madrid finally surrendered, and Franco declared victory.
The war was just defined by its brutality. The Nationalists used what's now called the White Terror, a very systematic, organized campaign to purge and execute anyone they saw as an enemy. In the Republican territory, you had the Red Terror, which was often more chaotic, exploding as government authority collapsed. But you know what? It was every bit as deadly. And the human toll, it's almost impossible to comprehend. The exact numbers are still debated today, but most historians agree that the total number of dead, from the fighting, from executions, from disease and starvation, was somewhere around 500,000 people. Just let that sink in. And when the fighting stopped, it wasn't replaced by peace. It was replaced by General Franco's dictatorship, which would rule Spain for nearly 4 decades. For years, the country was an outcast in Europe, and the deep wounds of the Civil War were just suppressed, never allowed to heal.
And this brings us all the way back to the beginning. The world watched as Spain burn, getting a terrifying preview of the global firestorm that was just around the corner. It leaves us with this one haunting question. If the world's democracies had made a different choice, if they had acted differently in Spain, could this tragedy, and maybe even the world war it foreshadowed, have been stopped?